All right. Are we ready? Sure. I'm taller, so I'm just gonna, I'll do this so you don't have to adjust. I can adjust my legs. Hi, everyone virtually, everyone here in the room. My name's Erin Scott. I am the new AMP Lab manager, so you'll be seeing lots more of me here in this wonderful space. Thank you so much for being here. First off, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge that the University of British Columbia, anyone living in this region here with us, are located on the traditional and unceded territories of the Syilx Okanagan peoples. I think it's important to do these land acknowledgements in ways that go beyond metaphor. So that's a good thing to think about. Welcome to our first Tech Talk of the year. This is a year-long offering that the AMP Lab will be doing. We're going to have a lot of wonderful guests coming in and doing various types of talks about digital work or tech-based research and creating this wonderful kind of fruitful space for conversation and communication. For those of you who are virtual, we have food here, so I'm so sorry you don't get any. For everybody else, once our talk, of course, enjoy a sandwich or 5, since there's lots. With that said, I will bring up the AMP Lab director, Karis Shearer, and she's going to get this whole thing going. Karis.
Thank you so much, everybody. It's great to see so many faces in the room, and also a big hello to the folks who are online joining us. It's wonderful to see a lot of names I recognize and some that I don't. You're all very welcome. This is our first Tech Talk of the year, as Erin mentioned. She's our new lab manager. We're thrilled to have her on board supporting this, some of our public events this year, the Tech Talk, our Epic Reading Series, and so on. And all the 8 different research projects in the lab. So we're going to have a busy year. We are a growing community of digital humanists. I'm delighted to introduce the first talk, which is a return in some important ways. Marjorie Mitchell is Research Data Management Librarian here at UBCO Okanagan. Felicity Tayler is Research Data Management Librarian at the University of Ottawa. They gave a tech talk in the lab here in 2019. It was February 2019, called Making SpokenWeb Research Data Public Through Research Creation. And we had a multi sort of series of workshops and events, and that kind of kicked off what became, I think, one of my favorite collaborations. Speaking as a literary researcher, faculty member, one of my favorite collaborations that I've ever done, which has resulted in a number of outputs by Marjorie and Felicity at different library conferences, at SpokenWeb symposia, and Constance Crompton, myself, and a number of other 30+ other digital humanists, data librarians have been involved in the creation of what we're about to launch, the Data Primer, Making Digital Humanities Research Data Public, or the Manual d'introduction aux données. I'm going to turn it over to them and thank Felicity in particular for traveling all of this way from Ottawa to join us in launching this, and Marjorie for leading the RDM work on this campus. I think it's been greatly beneficial to those of us, particularly researchers in many different disciplines, social sciences, humanities. I also want to mention that we're joined by 2 really special guests who are going to be the respondents for this event. Dr. Fiona McDonald, who leads the CE2 Lab, anthropologist, visual anthropologist, sensory ethnography. I'm really pleased and grateful that you're here. Nick Rochlin, who is also research data management here at UBCO. So 2 experts in different disciplines in the university. And so I thank you in advance for kicking off the question period that will end, it will start at around 12:30. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Felicity and Marjorie.
Hi, everyone in the room and on Zoom. I'm Felicity. And thank you to Karis for hosting us here in the AMP Lab. And there is something technical happening here. And it's a great pleasure for me to be back with Marjorie, who I work with pretty regularly online, but it's a real pleasure to be in person with her, and also to see Karis, who I haven't seen in several years. So what we're looking at on your screen, on the screen here in person, are the cover designs of our data primer. The data primer is a genre that's pretty popular in the research data management world. It's kind of like a mix between a pedagogical resource and a how-to guide, and sometimes there's a little bit of theory on how to work with data. And they are usually peer-reviewed, and they're often collaboratively authored. So this was the approach that we took to our data primer. So what it does is it takes many years of experience of digital humanities, data management, and data curation that Marjorie and I have gained from the SpokenWeb project, but also from supporting researchers in multiple different disciplines. And it distills this into some best practices that are legible to people working in digital humanities. So the reason that this is important is because without proper planning and data management, and which leads to good data curation, the value of the data that digital humanists are working with, as well as all of the labor that's invested in these very unique research processes for researching, collecting, and analyzing the data, it can very easily be lost. So this is one of the reasons why the data primer responds really well to needs in the disciplinary community, or the interdisciplinary community of digital humanities. The primer integrates best practices that have been taken from multiple different data intensive disciplines and translated into language that digital humanists will identify with, or even traditional humanists will recognize themselves in the primer. And this will help with writing a data management plan, which is something that the Tri-Council is going to start asking everybody who applies funding to do. And it also helps in project management. So it improves data curation strategies for collecting, managing, and publishing digital files and formats alongside traditional textual scholarship that humanities researchers are more comfortably trained in. The primer is pretty unique because we authored it collaboratively with over 30 digital humanist researchers who came and joined us in a 2-day online event. And so it really does represent, to the best of our abilities, a disciplinary approach to data curation and data management that's being reviewed and revised and rewritten by our peers in humanities discipline, but also in an open peer review process by data professionals. And a big part of what the data primer brings is a tool called the data flow and discovery tool, which is what you see pictured here and with all the little text scratches and pencil. It's really just a pretty basic worksheet that helps digital humanists sort out in their mind the workflow of their project, but according to how data lives inside all the different processes that are going to take place. And it asks some very key questions at very key moments in the research process that helps make sure that all the files go where they need to go, that the privacy is protected, that the communities you're working with are respected, and that your RAs can find the material as they change and move on in their academic careers and the research process continues. It doesn't have to be filled out in this messy way, but I like to use this picture to show how messy it can be and you still get good results out of it. And if we want to look at something a little less messy, this is an example of how the case study that the data primer is based on, which is the SpokenWeb the SpokenWeb partnership, which is a partnership of over 28 organizations across North America that are looking at digitizing audio literary archives. This is how the data flow and discovery model tool was useful to thinking through all the different working processes with data as multiple collections and multiple different archival contexts were being collected and digitized and needed to be organized in such a way that multiple different co-applicants in different institutions could come together and share the information to be able to produce the scholarly outputs that they wanted at the end, which included things like podcasts and instructional videos on top and like research creation projects on top of the traditional kind of textual outputs that come out of a large research project like this. And so the case study in the primer is really interesting because you see how these best practices can be applied in the SpokenWeb project, but you also see where the SpokenWeb project struggles with applying the best practices, because the idea isn't that you have a perfect outcome or all of the answers. The idea is that you use the tool to notice where you can't answer certain questions, and maybe you need to spend a little bit more time on an infrastructure level or on a practitioner level, or maybe you need to integrate it as a theoretical question in your research project in order to be able to think through why you can't answer the questions around a best practice, for example. And so the data primer kind of gives you the theoretical tools to be able to think through some of these questions as well. I'm gonna invite Marjorie to join me on this screen. And we'll talk a little bit more about the case study, maybe in relationship to the AMP lab where we're standing today.
Certainly. So the AMP lab has a comparatively small collection of audio recordings that were in an analog format at the beginning of this research project. And the students of the AMP lab have worked over time to be digitizing these. And so as soon as we moved from analog into digital, we needed to have a bit of a workflow and plan and procedure in place to be able to handle the various files that were developed. Because as you can see in this one, we start with a master wave file and then move it to an MP3 file and other accompanying files. Photographs are taken of all of the original objects, hence the JPEGs. And these all need to be related one to another so that you know that this photograph goes with this sound recording, which is on this particular physical object. And yes, so it was a very hands-on, very practical, and very manageable project to work through some of these questions. And at times, the data flow was as simple as a lovely little cardboard box that was entitled, "Don't touch me, I'm next." and at other times it was nested file structures living on the computers. So research data management isn't always about the most complicated system that you can come up with to handle things. Sometimes it is the simple, the somewhat obvious, but if it makes people's lives easier, then research data management plans are doing their job.
So that's a little bit about just, I mean, you have to read the primer in order to be able to get like the fulsomeness of the case study, but it's just a little taste of that. And now we're going to talk a little bit more about the process of putting the primer together and publishing it, because we made some very specific choices in terms of what formats we chose to publish and distribute the data primer, and also the partners that we picked in order to be able to do in order to have the most impact on both of the funding that we received and also for the amount of demand that Marjorie and I have had for leading data management and data curation workshops for digital humanists in beyond our own home institutions. So again, I'm going to pass the the mic to Marjorie because she's more of an expert on open educational resources than I am. But I do want to say that it was a very conscious choice to pick the OER as a format, as a publishing format. And one of the extreme kind of like happinesses that I have around this project is that by making these very deliberate choices all the way along in the production of the resource, and by writing it as something that would speak directly to a national community and even to an international community, I think this is coming out as like one of the first publications since our national organization, the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, has sort of consolidated and put a significant amount of investment behind these kinds of national level resources.
So we deliberately chose an open access publication, very much so it would be widely adopted and widely adapted over time. Digital humanities, no two labs are alike, no two projects are alike, and without the flexibility, adaptability, and ability to take the useful parts and ignore the rest and build them into processes, practices that are meaningful and useful to your research grouping, then the primer isn't serving its purpose without that flexibility. So we very much wanted to take the work that we had done that is based very much in best practices and turn it loose in the wild and let people use it and reuse it and build on it. And hopefully, well, we've attached a Creative Commons 4 license with a share alike attachment to it. So when you use it in your research, then your research will build upon it and also be open access and available to others to continue on. So very much in a collegial fashion, we are really proud to be releasing this and announcing it today.
Yeah, it's also a format that can be updated. One of the things that we heard during the groups that were writing this was that they wanted it to be, they didn't want a resource that would get produced as a PDF or a website that would just languish when the links needed to be updated. So this allows us to have some flexibility with the content over time. It has a permanent URL, so like people will always be able to find it. It can be distributed across multiple OER platforms, so it can be findable in multiple different places. And it's also designed for accessibility. So in DH, we put a lot of emphasis on the visuality of what we put out into the world. And I think that there's a lot of good reasons for that. And this is why the cover is so stunning. But the interior is actually pretty muted in it, and we'll show you the interior shortly, but it's pretty muted in its presentation. And a big part of that is because it's designed for accessibility so that screen readers can be used for people who are non-sighted, and so that other types of technology can be used in order to be able to give access to the content.
One more comment on Pressbooks. So Pressbooks will allow the downloading of the resource in a variety of formats. So if you want a PDF copy of it, you can get a PDF copy of it. You can share it and distribute it without checking back with us.
Yeah. So it's designed for flexibility and traveling through networks. So one of the reasons why Marjorie and I believe that we need this data primer for DH, and what we've heard from our communities is when we do the instruction that goes along with this, or that this came out of the workshops, the many workshops that we have done, we always open with kind of an icebreaker of what is your data, and this is the choices, the multiple choices that we give to the people in the room. And as you can see, it can vary in perspectives from people being very clear on what they believe their data to be, to I don't believe my relationship to research is defined by data. So this data primer should speak in multiple directions in order to be able to address all of these different on how humanists encountered as a cultural object. And this thinking really is indebted to Miriam Posner's work on how traditional humanists interface with this concept of data, which can also often be perceived as coming from the hard sciences. And I love showing this slide because Miriam put out this question of, you know, how do you relate to data, or what do you think your sources are data? And there was just like this endless thread of back and forth around from humanists around the globe, like taking a position on whether, you know, what their data was or was not, and how, and it just shows the variety of perspectives on how data moves through humanist spaces. So a primer is helpful because it gives people a common language to be able to respond to the requirements of funder exigencies. And then why should, so that's why we think the DH communities could use a primer like this that gives them a common language tool. And then why, this is also why we think the digital humanists or traditional humanists should care. Part of it is the altruism that's often built into the humanist approach, which is, you know, a desire for the collections that you work with or for the communities that you work with to be able to access the material that you've built in relationship with them. There's a huge amount of labor that goes into humanist projects. And so sharing the material that you have kind of collected with other humanists that are working in similar areas saves a huge amount of labor. You don't have to repeat work that's already been done. And there's a lot of attention that can be through sharing or through publishing data. There's a lot of attention that can be brought back to the cultural organizations and the communities that you work with that can then allow them to advocate on their own behalf for the resources that they need. So there's an altruism dimension to this. There's also a self-interest dimension, which is that if you're publishing your data, then or data sets within like the specific infrastructure that's being built for this, and that allows it to be traceable, which is detailed in the primer, then it's going to increase your citations and your online presence in a way that will be recognizable to other scholars and also to the general public in some ways. And then compliance really is going to become more and more of an issue for all of us. My personal philosophy is that the primer gives you the tools that you need to argue your agency in what you do and do not publish in your grant application. So it isn't that you're like compelled to publish something, it's that you need to be able to articulate an argument of why you shouldn't publish it if it shouldn't be published. And this is just basic ethics that you're already doing in your ethics application. But we now see in the SSHRC knowledge mobilization guidelines, for example, that there's an expectation that the knowledge mobilization will include storing data in the public domain where appropriate. So now I think we can have a little bit, so that's the why, and now we can look a little bit at how it works at the inside of it. Do you see that, or do you want me to do it?
You are more than welcome to lead us through this.
So I'm not sure what's going to happen when I click on this link. Let's see. I should have tried this beforehand. Just take us to another slide. Yeah. All right. But it's not showing up there.
Yes, it is.
It is? No, that's just the slide.
Oh,
Sorry for the awkwardness, everybody. All right. And show. And then where is your browser? Is here. Okay.
there we go. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Okay, so if you so let's say you've searched for this online, you found it through a Google search, or you found it through various platforms where OERs are published, or you clicked on a permanent link like in some other resource that takes you to it. You get a cover, you get a little synopsis of what it is, and then you click on read book. And we've put our acknowledgements first because there really was a lot of collective content that came through support from different organizations. But we also want to foreground our collaborators, who are many researchers. We had 4 main collaborators that came and gave talks that were kind of the foundation for the content of the primer. It gave us multiple different case studies to look at and different approaches. But there were over 30 digital humanists in the room, and the people who are acknowledged here were active in at the editing and the writing process of the primer. And we also had 2 open peer reviewers that are acknowledged as well. So we had a process built in to ask people whether they wanted to be named as contributors to the primer or not. And this is a really important part of how the primer responds to the community, because it had so many different places of insight. The navigation online is really simple. You can see from the table of contents that you have everything that begins with the data flow and the discovery model. It explains what data curation is, and when you should start doing it in your planning process, how you work through a data curation management process, document it, and then make sure that the rest of your team is kind of on board with enacting it. And some of the key areas where digital humanists often have crunchy problems are things like consent and intellectual property, or copyright around the materials that they're working, the cultural objects that they're working with. And so these sections begin with typical research questions, like typical questions that a researcher will arrive with. And then it explains how the data flow model questions help you think through the complexity of the difficult questions that you're asking in your research project. And then it gives you a little discursive explanation of how you can approach those questions in order to be able to embed best practices in your work. And it gives you a little a little example, like a case study example of how this was tackled in the SpokenWeb project in order to be able to put the best practices into a concrete example. And as Marjorie said, you can navigate it on the web, or you can export it as a PDF. And there are also references at the end that gives you other places to go if you want to look more deeply into Indigenous, like working with data from Indigenous communities, for example. It gives you some other places to go for that kind of information. So that's kind of what it looks like on the inside. And I'll go back to the so those are the researcher questions that kind of structure the inside. These are the acknowledgements of the collaborators. Do you have anything you wanted to say about the collaborators?
Just that truly, without them, without the collaborators, the data primer would have been a thin soup. They very much added context and body and raised questions, not that we hadn't necessarily thought of, but that were absolutely valuable to be including within the primer. And so we really do owe them a debt of gratitude. And for those of you who hopefully adopt and utilize the primer, it is, keep in mind, it is the collaborators as well as us that have moved this forward. And yes, it has been fruitful and rewarding, and we do owe them this huge debt of gratitude.
Yeah. Well, which is why we all invited you and sent you links to join us, because we wanted to be able to really like sing your praises. It's also a bit of an unusual funding structure because SSHRC, it's extremely difficult to get practical projects like this funded through SSHRC. Like it's actually kind of a gap in the funding landscape, which we're hoping that the Digital Research Alliance of Canada will start to fill, but this remains to be seen. So, you know, props to SSHRC for putting out a research data management capacity initiative, which is where the funds came from. But I'm also extremely thankful to University of Ottawa Library for having the vision and the foresight to put up the funds, the seed funds that we needed to secure the funding from SSHRC. It's somewhat unusual for a library to take that kind of position, and I think it's really had huge returns and will continue to have huge returns into the future for our national community. And also thank you to the Digital Research Alliance of Canada and the national training group that I'm part of that will help to communicate this out into the wider community and will give some gravitas to the best practices that are inside the resource. And there's also part of the primer that is so one of the things that happened in the workshops was that there were many desires expressed for something that would go beyond what the scope of this primer offers. And so there's actually a part of the primer that is like articulates desires into the future for what other primers could address, which are much more difficult or complex areas that absolutely need to be addressed and could definitely use primers or some other kind of resources to respond to them. But I thought it was really important for us to include it in this primer so that like as a key part of the resource. So it sort of writes the possibility for these things to exist into the future. Yeah. So thank you, everyone. Maybe we should put the link into like the Zoom chat.
I'm going to
Yeah.
Zoom chat. Thank you so much. I want to invite Dr. Fiona McDonald to ask the first question as a respondent.
Okay, do I ask from here?
Yeah, you can. What burning questions do you have?
Everyone online, they won't.
We will repeat.
Okay,
Yeah.
unless you want to just come up. No, I'll allow you to say something. Okay, perfect. Okay, first of all, a massive heartfelt congratulations as a social scientist, digital humanist, with the gift you're giving with this across the disciplinary conversations. First of all, I'm just going to make a comment first and foremost is that right at the beginning, I really loved the clear articulation of data curation as a methodology.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that we don't call out enough, but that you also took the time to parse out the difference between research material and research data. And I feel like our students conflate it all. They just say data and then just all sort of blends and melds.
I have a question about one piece of data.
Secondary literature as part of the data management plan as well. I was wondering if that ever came up in your conversation, because it's something I talk with my students about, like how are you going to manage and organize your literature, your secondary literature, primary literature. So I wanted to know if that came up in your conversations.
So if I can quickly summarize,
Congratulations.
congratulations. That frequently that we've looked at research data as a methodology, and frequently students are conflating research materials and data, and that hopefully this primer will help clarify that. And then your question to us was whether we had looked at or included or talked about the use of secondary materials
Yes.
within a research data management plan. Have I
Yes, and how is that sort of like being articulated in the digital humanities?
and so how are secondary materials being articulated in a research data management plan in the digital humanities?
The data curation as a methodology, I think, is actually one of the strengths of digital humanities. We just haven't figured out how to write the data papers that show that this is our strength yet. Which is why I push data papers in the primer, but because we have some good papers to write. But the other thing is the conflation in terms of data and research materials is also not just a student. In my experience, it's not just a student experience. Like there are some, like I always take the approach with research data management that the professors are experts in their domain, and that this primer is written for people who are like really truly advanced experts in their domain, but there might be some aspects of how to put the infrastructure of data management that comes out of not a space that's not their discipline in relationship to what they're already doing. So most professors and researchers are practicing researchers are already doing data management and data curation in some form. But there is often this question of, are the pictures of the archival materials that I'm working with, are they my data, or are they my research material? And it totally depends on what they're doing in the project. Like if the project is to put this stuff online, then it's your data. But if the project is just to transcribe into an Excel sheet from the pictures, then it's your research material. So these are really interesting kind of nuances that students struggle with, but also the professors struggle with. And to have a tool that can help make that distinction in the classroom, but also in like a professional setting, I think is really useful. And then the third part of the question was about secondary materials. And it's interesting, I guess I want to be more precise about what are the secondary materials that we're talking about.
Well, I think one, we have a habit of taking them out of research or thinking that they're outside of data management, but managing secondary materials is very important.
Yeah.
As well as part of that. And I'm just wondering if that ever came up as part of your conversation.
Are we talking about secondary data sets, or are we talking about like the articles that you're reading?
Articles and books and literature.
Yeah.
Something that reflects as a Zotero.
Yes. Okay. So the answer is Zotero or some other kind of citation management software, and it's definitely part of what's interesting is that it can't. I want to kind of defer to Marjorie on this one because I think she actually has more experience talking about secondary materials than I do. Like my practice is really talking about publishing data and the infrastructure for publishing data once all of those questions have been parsed. But I know that Marjorie has really regular experience talking about citation management software in relationship to this.
And again, it is always project dependent, and always how the secondary data is relating to the output. So if you are looking at a Statistics Canada chart, so Statistics Canada has the raw data, they have analyzed the raw data, and you are looking at an analysis of the raw data. So you're not viewing necessarily the raw data, you're looking at the secondary data. And you're then incorporating the secondary data into your research. And it is at that point in time becomes very much a citational matter as opposed to a research data management issue, simply because the original data and the secondary source live elsewhere. You are not the sole creator of the secondary data. So as I say, it becomes citational then at that point, as opposed to requiring your active management.
I think the primer is sort of silent on the matter, but but it's because it's considered kind of out of scope. But I don't think it would be incorrect to incorporate that in a data management plan if you felt that it would be helpful. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It was more soundboarding and riffing on that, but I definitely.
It's a good question though. Like now that, I guess it's silent on it because we treated it as out of scope, but it
but then you
certainly
go into
could be.
future action.
Yes, exactly.
My favorite part.
Yeah, I love the future actions part.
Thank you both very much.
Yeah.
Thank you for the good question.
Well, a long-winded one. Nick, over to you.
All right, well, also congratulations, of course. You've taken this huge
Yeah.
and distilled it to a really tight and accessible resource. And we're talking about these future directions. I'm glad you teed that up because working with so many people, I'm curious if there are any particular topics or concepts that you found particularly challenging to keep out of the primer, and more generally, how are decisions around scoping just to keep it as tight as it was kept?
I'm just bringing up the future directions part because I love it so much. And there's people on the call who are particularly helpful in thinking about what the importance of the future directions. And as you can see, it is quite an extensive
I'm going to-
section.
I'm going to share it with the Zoom audience.
Oh, is it not?
It's
Yes,
not shared
okay.
with Zoom
Thank you.
audience.
Thank you, Marjorie. Yeah, so once it's shared, you'll see just quite how extensive that section is. And it's not just an afterthought, it really was a section that we worked with intentionality. So the question is, were there any parts that went into future directions that were difficult to keep out of like the core resource? And one of them and there's different reasons why you might struggle with that. One of them might be sort of like the affect of feeling like something really needs to be addressed, and that is not being addressed in the larger landscape, and that there's an urgency to it. So in that sense, there was some very important voices that were asking for a primer of this kind to be written, but from the point of view of the communities and the populations that the researcher is taking the data from. And we've seen like social sciences is excellent at producing these kinds of guides. Usually they're guides that are distributed among like at-risk populations, on the deaf side, for example. But in our and so it does the work of giving agency to the people who are participating in academic research, but from a non-academic position, which has a power differential to the researchers. And so the voices in the rooms that we were having this discussion with were really putting a lot of emphasis on the artists that are involved in humanities projects, for example. So there are many artists who operate within the context of the university and who have academic positions. Some of them are tenured, but many artists are community members. And increasingly they're sought out by academics to partner on projects that sort of turn their work into data in some ways. And so that was one area where we knew that there was a great deal of urgency and that we felt that urgency in the rooms. So cultural, not just artists, but like cultural producers at large, right, from different kinds of communities that have their own protocols for how things circulate, and also different economies that are not just the academic economy, where people actually really need to like keep their intellectual property so that they can have a living. And so that was an area that I think is a really important future direction, where there was sort of an effective difficulty to not address it because we felt that urgency. Yeah.
And that one there, this was my next question, but it was that there is synergistic work on your point 3 future directions between the Canadian Artist Representation artifact and exactly this primer that would sort of establish new protocols that would require funding agencies, trying council to actually think not just about ticking the box, is this Indigenous research, but what aspects is this creative creationist, and thinking ethically about the role and IT. I just feel like there's your next collaboration.
Yeah.
Artifact.
Yeah. So I come out of the artisan central milieu, and a lot of my like my scholarly work looks at the history of CARFAC and artist representation and rights in the protocols around that. And so it's been really interesting to watch those parallel developments in that area. And I think there's definitely a conversation to be had, and I think that the funding agencies have a role in that conversation. I think that the challenge actually is that the funding agencies are the catalyst for this change, right? The funding agencies are really doing the social engineering that's producing this discursive space and producing my job and Nick's job and Marjorie's job, and then producing all of the documents that will go into the funding streams in order to be able to argue data management practices. And I'm really curious to see how, and then, but they don't want to give us the structure for how to act in this environment. And it's not really their role to give us the structure on how to act. It's the researchers' role, I guess, in theory, or the disciplinary community's role in theory, to be able to like determine their own way of acting inside this Foucauldian structure. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, and I think that is where we're going to start to see some really crunchy problems in the next couple of years. And I think we're only going to be able to kind of really tackle it on a precedent setting kind of like, and this is my personal opinion, right? Like my personal opinion, I think what we're going to see is a lot of kind of painful precedents being set if we're not careful. But I can also speak from experience, like working with key organizations that are mandated to represent particular groups that that have protocols that don't align with the TCPS2, for example, already don't align with the Tri-Council practices, mandated practices. They're on the ball. They're keeping an eye on this, and they have very informed and deep opinions about how consultation should move forward and how evaluations should take place. The key issue is that they're not resourced to be able to action it. Yeah, we can take questions from the online audience too. Oh yeah.
Just kind of dial this back to some, like, I'm thinking about if I'm a humanist arriving at this.
Yes.
And I've not thought about data before. Can you just kind of map out an example? Let's say I'm a humanist, I work in historical archives, literary archives of like 18th century. I transcribe letters, I transcribe poems, maybe. What is my data?
What do you do with the poems?
I'm going to publish them in 18th century working class book. I'm going to transcribe letters between.
What is your data? I mean, I suppose the data, feel free to join me in this exercise. It's an interesting example. I can kind of counter with a different example that will take us in a different direction. But so in that particular case, and Marjorie can totally correct me, but are there RAs involved in this transcription process? Yeah.
The digital edition.
Yeah.
There's some RAs.
Yeah.
The archives in the UK.
Yeah.
I'm going to photograph.
And it's 19th century poetry?
It's 18th century.
18th century poetry.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
It's out of copyright.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm going to photograph in the archives.
Yeah.
So that, so just
Yeah.
curious out to me, like how this would be useful.
So how this would be useful would be thinking about like the tools that you're going to need to, like the cameras and other kind of like digitization tools or scanners or whatever tools that you're going to need, going into the archive in order to do the digitization work that you want to do, but you also start, and this is where we need the, do we want to put up the workflow? We should put up the workflow. So you want to, so typically you might think, okay, I've got to start by contacting the archives and asking permission to go and like look at the stuff. But what the workflow does is it kind of asks you to think about something else from the beginning, which is like who's the owner of the material that you're going to work with. So it begins with this question of consent. In the case of 18th century materials that are in an archive, often what you're going to have to do is negotiate the terms of ownership with the archive because the copyright of the author has expired. So even though things are in the public domain, sometimes the archives don't let you use the materials unless you're using their photograph of the material, and that photograph of the material belongs to the archive. So then you have to negotiate consent with the institution. And if they give you their photographs, then you're going to go down the road of negotiating copyright to reproduce those photographs if you want to have photographs, but perhaps the transcription is not within copyright. So that might be why you choose to do the labor of transcription and bring in RAs to do that labor of transcription. And so, that might be like your workaround, the consent part in the case of an 18th century archive. And then the next part is your data collection. So your data collection is all the planning that you need to do about like what technology you're going to use to transcribe. So how many laptops do you need on your team? Who's using the laptops? What kind of passwords do they have to like log into the laptops and keep your data safe? There probably aren't privacy concerns because the people involved are like outside of the Archives Act, like privacy law. But what you do have is sort of this human resources question of how do all the people on the team like communicate with each other across the multiple different technology platforms that we have. And how do you kind of document the process that you're going to talk to the rest of your team through at the same time?
And it is also as simple as really trying to think critically about all of the things that you are generating. Is there any reason that you may need to be keeping a student's emails who has done particular work for you? Maybe they've struggled with figuring out what a word on maybe these were handwritten letters and they've struggled with figuring out what an actual word was. And this was an important word. And so you had several back and forths, and that might be a useful thread to explicate within your edited edition. And so there are reasons and time, but when you decide, again, it very much is trying to think ahead, not to endless and ridiculous possibilities of research, but to, oh, this might happen and we will do this. So we have a space and it's called this, and the files that go in there are this kind of file, and everybody knows on our research team knows that these kinds of files go into this particular space. And here are the people who have access to it, and so on and so forth. So it is a little bit of imagining your best self in the future and just taking the steps. Any PI is a practiced enough researcher to have come across some kind of data disaster. Whether your hard drive has failed, whether you've lost the notebook that had the transcription, whether you lost your phone or it went for a swim. There are all kinds of ways to have data failures, and simply really critically thinking about, okay, I need to download these photos onto my Flickr account or whatever as soon as I get home from the archives. Mm-hmm. That is a research data management plan. It doesn't need to be complex or sophisticated or unrealistic. It needs to be regularized so that it becomes a practice, and it needs to be shared very explicitly. just recently, and talking with a colleague this morning, was saying it's about taking the tacit knowledge that people have and making it more explicit so that everyone is on the same. Thank you, Nick, for that conversation this morning.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
The Data Primer is kind of beautifully articulated in Digital Humanities, that we've done such a nice job just now, of, like mapping out the conceptual to anyone who in social sciences.
Yeah.
So much.
I-
Any online questions?
I don't believe so. No, no questions.
I'm just watching the time. So I would like to thank you so much for sharing sharing the background story of this, highlighting the collaborators, making this available. It's been a 3-year project and it's gone through so many iterations, so many different workshops. This is a lot of hard work, and I just want to celebrate you and thank you for being here. And invite folks to the stage, hats, snacks, and chat more with Marjorie.
And we will say good.
online.
We will say goodbye to all of our online audience. Thank you so very much for attending, even though you weren't here to share the snacks with us. We'll see you again.